You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're going back to the 2020 Rail Volution conference, where Peter Calthorpe gave the keynote speech with Allison Brooks. They discussed the next generation of TOD and how arterials might be the solution to our housing dilemmas. Stay with us. This podcast was produced in partnership with Rail Volution and appeared first on the Rail Volution podcast. You can find the Rail Volution podcast on your podcatcher of choice for a deeper dive on livability issues, or if you want to check out the annual conference this fall in Phoenix, Arizona, visit railvolution.org. That's railvolution.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting this podcast as well as Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We couldn't produce the show without your help. To join this merry band of dreamers and support the show, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. For $2 a month, we'll send you stickers and a handwritten note. For $10 a month, we'll send you one of our famous bus-only scarves. We just got in a new shipment, so we're ready for the new year. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of the Overhead Wire, sharing information on cities around the world with our readers and subscribers. Join us and try our one-of-a-kind daily newsletter for 2 weeks free. No credit cards, just an email address by visiting theoverheadwire.com. We've got 71,000 news links in our archive tagged by topic, so sign up and search away. And finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning in Practice. Go to raymondunwin.com to find out how you can download the book in your podcatcher and listen to each chapter like an episode of the show. We have a free Word document with timestamps on the site as well. Now let's start 2021 off right. Happy New Year, and let's get moving. Before we get to this week's show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And subscribing means you get both this show, Talking Headways, and Mondays at the Overhead Wire, where this music I'm talking about comes from, on the same feed. 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. Subscribe today.
Hello, Rail Volution friends and colleagues. I'm Allison Brooks, and I am excited to join Rail Volution today for what I expect to be a thought-provoking presentation and discussion on the future of transit-oriented development with our keynote speaker, Peter Calthorpe. In the early 90s, Peter developed the concept of transit-oriented development described in his book, The Next American Metropolis, Ecology, Community, and the American Dream. It was a response to the siloing of transportation and land use, suburban sprawl, and urban disinvestment. Since then, TOD has become a field of practice, the foundation of many regional policies and city plans around the world. And Rail Volution has been a valuable venue, bringing together the practitioners, community leaders, and decision makers to fine-tune and advance the concept. And like any established field of practice, especially one that intends to help achieve important social equity, environmental mobility, and livability goals in our cities and regions, TOD is not above critical evaluation. We need to be continually asking the hard questions of ourselves, making sure TOD is meeting its goals as intended, including advancing racial equity. Some of you may have borne witness to the Pechakucha that G.B. Arrington and I performed in Pittsburgh a couple of years ago, entitled, I'm Breaking Up with Todd. The premise being that TOD personified was in fact not living up to his, her, or their potential in many places, and for a variety of reasons. I'm expecting Peter's presentation to be a bit more technical, certainly with a lot less swear words, focused on helping us recalibrate TOD as a practice at this time of unprecedented change as we face climate change, a health pandemic, social upheaval. As a heads up, Peter is going to share some examples from California before you roll your eyes or tune out, because we have it all figured out here. Just note that the ideas and concepts he's putting forward are applicable all over the US and being applied in places around the globe. Today's session will be in two parts, starting with Peter laying the groundwork and sharing some information about his research and ideas. Then we'll dig deeper and examine the challenges, opportunities, and implications for our work through the Q&A. So I'm going to say a few words introducing Peter, and then I'm going to hand it over to him. So Peter Calthorpe's 30-year practice has helped solidify a global trend toward the key principles of new urbanism. He has written a series of books starting in 1986 with Sustainable Communities. And his series of books since then, Metropolis magazine claims, trace the recent history of urban design in its most vital and prescient manifestations. Peter is one of the founders and first president of the Congress for the New Urbanism, winner of the Urban Land Institute's J.C. Nichols Prize for Visionaries in Urban Development. He was appointed to the President Council for Sustainable Development and the UN High Commission on the New Urban Agenda. He provided direction for HUD's Empowerment Zone during the Clinton administration and did consolidated planning programs and helped rebuild some of the country's worst public housing. His work in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East has demonstrated that community design with a focus on environmental sustainability and human scale can be adapted throughout the globe. His current work throughout China is focused on developing standards and examples of low carbon cities, leading to the publication of Emerald Cities, Planning for Smart and Green China, and the adoption by the Chinese State Council of its design principles. Peter joined the international multidisciplinary design and engineering firm HDR in 2019. And now I'm going to hand it over to Peter.
So thank you for that. I didn't realize I could swear. And did I warn you that the dogs may come back as soon as we start this? Can you hear them in the background? I'm sorry about that. But this is the nature of communication from home. I'm going to go ahead and do my share screen because I want to quickly go through some slides. This is going to be a little bit more than just TOD. You know, it's my opinion that we've been battling global sprawl for, actually that's a virus that's been growing slowly for 50 years, but maybe is just as pathogenic as the one we have today. And ways to defeat it, of course, do focus on transit-oriented development, but that transit-oriented development really has to be different in different places and obviously different in different times. So let me go through this slideshow. This is a book that I'm working on now for the World Bank on ending global sprawl, which will actually lay out some design standards in three different contexts. And quickly, I was going to go overseas, but then focus back here in the United States on what I think the next generation of TOD will look like. China and some of Asia has perfected something called high density sprawl, where the density is high, but the outcomes are just as bad, if not worse, than our low density variety here. They've given themselves up to automobiles. They were once a bicycle country. And the pathology is now being treated with massive investments in metro. Now, this kind of investment doesn't seem to be anything we're capable of perfecting politically, but it is the solution that is being used in China. Here's a growth area in Chongqing, a city of 30 million. That's about the size of Canada. And this is a small area for 4 million new population, basically blanketed with metro. So I think that this is one solution. But what one of the elements is that only 30% of households in China these days have cars. The rest of them don't. So the idea that there would be auto-free streets that are dedicated to transit and to bikers and to walking makes all the sense in the world. A radical notion, but it comes back to our sensibility that public right-of-ways really are definitive in how we allocate that space determines how we move, what kind of mobility. A large part of the world, the developing world, has a disease called low-income sprawl, where the poor are pushed to the periphery in largely informal settlements. In Mexico City, we looked at what these settlements are like, and they're all too distant. The average commute, 3 hours in many cases. And the social housing above has lots of space for cars, encouraging all the wrong forms of mobility. But within the city, the chaos of jitneys and privately owned transit service creates chaos that is truly dysfunctional. This is an environment where infill housing near jobs and culture is important. I'm working today in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, a place where 90% of trips are on motorcycles. And working with Robert Severo there, we discovered that a lane of electric motorcycles can carry more passengers per peak hour than BRT or light rail. So there are different forms of transit, whether it's auto-free streets or electric motorcycles. Different cultures, different economies, different parts of the world need to be thought of in creative ways. Just to come back to our home ground, we all know what this is a picture of. Our suburban environment designed largely around automobiles, which is becoming more and more dysfunctional. The antidote was to begin to reshape our cities around rail, light rail largely, and transit-oriented development. And to a certain degree, there's been powerful successes. And the thinking and the form of regional growth often leans towards this strategy. The problem that I'm coming through, becoming clearer and clearer on, is that we need more transit than we can afford. We need transit to be closer to everybody, to operate quicker, and be less expensive to run. As light rail moves up to 100 million a mile in some cases, and then ongoing fare box return deficits lead us to really struggling with getting enough transit in place to make a dent in travel behavior. In LA, there's a lot of potential investment in BRT, which I think is a healthy direction, but I'll talk about how we can springboard from there forward into even more progressive and interesting ideas of how transit shapes. But let's go back to basics. I always kind of come to this study that we did for the whole state of California, looking at sprawl versus TOD. And the takeaway here is just how important it is. The physical environment we shape determines our behavior. And here's just looking at 3 neighborhoods, San Francisco and Berkeley and the East Bay sprawl. You can see carbon emissions tripling, land consumption up by a factor of 15, household VMT also tripling. These are variables that are profound and exist today. So we know if we build the right kind of environments, we can get much better outcomes. And what are the outcomes? Well, this study looked at business as usual, which is 70% of standard sprawl, versus 55%, not urban per se, but town, kind of street, a modern version of a streetcar suburb, low rise, high density, mixed use, and walkable. I think you're all familiar with this. But the graphics are stunning, or the physical results are stunning. Through 2050, LA looks like this with sprawl, and like this, same population increase with more compact mixed-use development. So the benefits are huge, and we can measure them in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of vehicle miles traveled, which translates into a whole range of other impacts in terms of air quality and oil dependencies and a lot of other things, and household costs, I think, more significantly. This is just a map of the LA region showing VMT per household by location, and it tells a fairly blunt story about peripheral expansion. The building energy gets better. Respiratory costs, we can now calculate heart disease and activity-related implications. All these different issues are deeply connected. This is a map of walk versus indicators. Infrastructure cost. All the arrows point in the same direction, but fundamental change is difficult. This is maybe the most important, which is household affordability. This is just transportation and household utilities, a savings of $10,000 per annum on average. This is a really important point for the struggling working families of this country. It's not just what you live in, it's where you live. So a whole systems approach is always really key to this. I think that most of you understand how all these vectors intersect, but land consumption goes down by an incredible amount when we start to think about more compact transit-oriented development. So we understand that there are some big solutions out there, and we're having a hard time getting them done. This is the real dilemma. And in California, we have a housing crisis, primarily for working families, not for the wealthy who can afford to live in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, but for everybody else who does all the real heavy lifting. Where are they? We're only 50% affordable in our state, and we're about 3.5 million households short of where we need to be. And of course, a deficit in housing drives housing costs up. And as housing costs go up, lower income people move farther and farther to the periphery of the region where the old formula of drive till you qualify still seems to dominate. But I want to address this, it's kind of at the heart of what's going on in America today, I think. This is a map done by the Center for Neighborhood Technology, Scott Bernstein, you probably well know. Typically, foreclosures are evenly spread throughout a region. When downturns happen, when households can't meet their needs, it's across the board. But in 2008, which was supposed to be a debacle of Wall Street and subprime mortgages, and that seems to be where everybody points their finger, the reality is the foreclosures all came in distant, low-density suburbs. The truth of the matter is we were building too much of the wrong kind of housing in the wrong place. And the only way they could move the inventory was to discount the point of sale. That, I think, is at the systemic heart of this. Our old paradigm that you just keep building suburbs farther and farther out, and that gives you your affordable entry-level housing, collapsed in 2008. And we have no new paradigm. We have no new solution because the politics of infill, as you all know, is really ragged, really difficult. I think the answer lies right here in the arterials. We've built the suburbs, the inner suburbs around a network of arterials to enhance the car. We lined it with commercial that is dying now because of Amazon and online training. We have these ribbons of decay everywhere, which can become the places that we infill, redevelop, and create opportunities for transit. I call it grand boulevards. In typical arterial dimensions, you can have all of this. You can have good sidewalk environments, bikeways. You can have dedicated lanes for transit, and I'll talk about what form that takes. And you can even have a few goddamn cars. All right, so that's a nice idea, but is it an anecdote? Is it just a trivial, put it on the long list of the kinds of things we should be doing? Or is it a systemic strategy? Is it really big? So I had, using urban footprint, we went out and did a whole series of studies to look at where and how much of this could happen. And also looking at housing costs, land supply, entitlement costs, construction costs, impact fees, affordable subsidies. These are all the things that stack up when you have to think about where and how you put housing. And then there's the politics, which you all know. traffic and transportation. Everybody says no more housing here. It's going to generate traffic. Change the neighborhood character. We can't afford the community services. Well, that's always true if you go low density. We don't have enough open space. Our schools are overloaded. There's a whole range of issues here that I think you can actually find systemic solutions to. As I said, we use urban footprint because it allows us to very quickly look at huge databases and propose scenarios. And the scenario we were looking at here was, well, how much commercial land is there that's underutilized? You know, anything on a 0.5 FAR is underutilized. And what kind of economics would surround redeveloping it? So the first solution that came across the boards in California was just to do straight TODs, draw circles around transit stations and upzone everything, housing, commercial, the whole 9 yards. And the backlash was huge. The idea of invading and demolishing stable residential neighborhoods, it was really not that attractive. And in my mind, if not necessary, why do it? And in other circumstances, such as San Francisco, it meant that a large swath of the city would be open for redevelopment. And we've seen the impacts of massive redevelopment in some of our historic affordable housing complexes, huge failures in preservation and in character. So my first look was to look at El Camino. It's an old strip that runs through the center of Silicon Valley, 43 miles. And it turned out, going through our analysis, that we could fit 250,000 households on that strip. The software allowed us to identify just commercial parcels, not touching any apartment complexes, not going inside of any single family neighborhoods, just locating a strip commercial along the way. And you know, here's a picture, it's familiar to everybody. But these boxes, these brick and mortar are dying because of online shopping. And they're dying in terms of placemaking. And yet we have zoning controls that pretty much lock us into this. So by replacing all that land with mixed use, some multifamily, some townhouse, we also get a huge range of affordable environmental impacts, whether it's water, energy, driving, greenhouse gas, transportation costs. We can calculate all this and put this right alongside. We then took this study of one strip and said, well, what happens if we look at the whole Bay Area? It turns out that you've got 15,000 acres of what I call gray fields, these parking lots and single-story buildings lining arterials. That can produce up to 1.37 million new housing units. And they turn out to be just in the right place, right in the middle of where the job centers are, so the commutes are not so long. It also places density along around 700 miles of arterials, which all can receive additional transit. If you look at fire and flood hazards, you get the same story, which is these locations are very well positioned. And so the same kind of environmental impact results, which is a win when compared to just the average house in a cross-cutting county, Alameda. So these are all win-win. Why can't we make it happen? The market demand, a lot of people say, well, yeah, but you're talking about multifamily housing and everybody wants single family. Well, it turns out that actually the real need, the unmet need, is for multifamily units by every analysis. And there are many households that would trade a yard in a distant location, if they actually had the means to choose it, for a more affordable townhouse or condominium or rental unit closer to their workplace, closer to the center of action. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but what's fascinating is the tax base for that, all those gray fields, is pretty low because the values are low. The moment you rezone it for higher density mixed use, the property taxes go through the ceiling you get it in this particular case, $14 billion a year of additional taxes. That's not counting the share that goes to the state to cover schools and things like that. And with that, you could put out bonds for around $34 billion. With that, you could split it. Just 20% of that bonding capacity will buy you about 20 million a mile on those 700 miles. You can subsidize housing, 30% of the housing with just 10 billion of that 34. So this is a self-financing strategy, largely because the underutilized land is undervalued. We did the same study in LA County, came up with the same results. The old TOD standard, which is, pretty healthy there because of the BRT approach that's going on. But we, in one county, identified close to 20,000 acres. The punchline here is that this is actually more than enough for the next generation or two of housing. And it would balance our communities in terms of that oversupply of single family. And it would do it in places close to jobs and out of harm's way environmentally. Now, there is a range of housing types, and I'm going to have to rush through all this. And it starts with live work that can sit right on a arterial in different forms, and then walk-up apartments and the more traditional podium apartments and lofts. It comes in many sizes and shapes, and it's well known, and many developers think this actually is the sweet spot in the market today. At TODs, you can even go high-rise. So I'll wrap up by talking about what I think is the other component. If you have the mixed-use ribbons, how do you create the transit? How do you create enough transit to allow that a quantity of housing to be infilled? It ain't autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles are going to just cost us more BMT. There's a whole lecture dedicated to that alone, but basically deadhead trips and zero occupant vehicles will drive the congestion through the ceiling. Less vehicles, more congestion. It's not the right formula for the future. And expanding our heavy rail with more light rail is a good thing. It's the backbone, but what we really need is a network that puts everybody within close range of getting into the transit system. And that's got to be cheap enough to build ubiquitously. And that's, I think, where the technology can help us. Back to El Camino. You know you're in good shape when you can't tell the difference between a parking structure and a building. But this is what it looks like. This is the heart of Silicon Valley. And this is what it can look like. I showed you this picture before. That's the same 120-foot right-of-way. We all know bus rapid transit is the most cost-effective, and it's the right place to start. Just dedicated lanes to transit along all those 700 miles would be a giant first step, and maybe the technology is buses. In China today, they have autonomous rapid buses. And that's one step along the path once you've got that dedicated right-of-way. But even more interesting to me is this, that they're studying now in Singapore, which is small autonomous vans on dedicated lanes. You know, autonomy can work a lot sooner on dedicated right-of-ways than it can anywhere else, largely because the complexity of a mixed environment is a heavy lift for safety. But if you put them on dedicated lanes, as you show here, those autonomous vans can be up and running sooner rather than later in terms of safety and technology. But most importantly, they can all be express vehicles. On your phone, you can go to a station and say, I'm going to a certain destination. And the whole system can organize itself to get you a vehicle with a few other people in it that are going direct to destination. It may even be that passing lanes aren't necessary because a vehicle-to-vehicle communication would allow passing skip stop using oncoming traffic lanes. Complicated, but actually well within the technology's domain. Now, I had Fair and Peers sit down with me on this one because nobody believes me when I throw numbers around. And they said, well, clearly compared to BRT, the average speed, to LRT, the average speed is improved by 27%. That's because it's largely skip stop, direct to destination. The O&M costs are way down by 40%, and that's obvious. There's no drivers, which was a big part of transit costs. And construction costs could be more than 75%. So we have cheap and fast and easy to operate. That's something we can make ubiquitous. That's something that could form the foundation for this kind of grand boulevard strategy as a next generation of our growth. That idea we played out in these California towns, but I think could be anywhere USA. I'll leave you with the great Churchill quote about how we shape the buildings, then they shape us. It's more true about urban design and community form. Once we lay down that pattern, it begins to really impact our behavior. And so we need to find the right patterns. We need to find a new paradigm, quite frankly, of what the next generation of growth looks like. Because the last one died in 2008 in the middle of the financial crisis, and we have not found a new one. We've just been stuck. So with that, I will just get out of this mode and go into conversation mode.
Thank you, Peter. That was great and thought-provoking. And I've organized some questions initially, kind of by sector, but we can jump around. You painted a really bold picture of a transit-oriented future that calls for a truly integrated mix of different types of transit and use of our city streets. And there's also a shift from focus of TOD around fixed rail, light rail, commuter heavy. Can you comment a little bit more on that? And I think there's an important part of this, like who's responsible for making that happen? What's the role of transit agencies or city planners, regional planners, in helping, from your perspective, make something like this transition?
Well, I've long been a believer in regional planning because, of course, mobility cuts across city boundaries. So you say the city is going to do these kinds of things alone never really works. And so we have regional transportation entities that take care of this stuff. Although we know one of our greatest hurdles is that transit agencies are fractured, around the Bay Area. I don't know how many there are, and they're not well coordinated. So yes, there's an institutional issue here, which is to build more transit, which is the armature for more infill and mixed-use environments. Will take a coordinated effort at the regional scale. Honestly, I think that we need state legislation. We used to have state legislation for redevelopment agencies in the state of California, and that allowed infill to be coordinated at a larger scale. It was abused, but it also allowed for financing to come in to make it happen in a coherent manner, coherent phasing. So that's state level legislation. I think you need that. I'll be even more radical. Given the uneven response by local jurisdictions to infill, is that a kind way of putting the NIMBY world? It's interesting to me, it's an anecdote, along El Camino, you have several cities that have picked up on the idea that it's great to build something other than parking lots on that strip. And they've started doing the infill. And they tend to be the more open-minded, less closed off, and less wealthy. The really wealthy cities like Palo Alto and Atherton and Mendel, they don't want anything to do with any more housing. They'll take all the jobs, they'll take all the trips that the jobs create, but they won't take any more housing. So I think that another thing that could happen at the state level is as of right. New York has had as of right zoning for a very long time. Don't know my history that well. And it basically says, if it's zoned a certain way, you can build. You don't have to go through 20 community meetings and 70 public hearings. You can just do it. If you want a variance, then you got to go through all the rigmarole. So there needs to be a baseline, this is what we all agree can and should happen. And each jurisdiction doesn't seem to be able to get there. And once again, we live in regional worlds. And so when one place says not here, it begins to distort the larger framework. So the affordable housing all ends up in a different town, and long distance commuting starts, and a whole sequence of bad results take place because of this local control, which, God bless it, I think we need local control for all the fine-grained decisions and all the kind of idiosyncratic qualities that places have to have. But there needs to be a baseline. And the baseline should be fair share in affordable and workforce housing. Every city should take their fair share. So I've come more and more to believe we need state legislation to make these kinds of big, coherent decisions really happen. We can have small demonstration projects, that's great. Mm-hmm. But for it to really become the next paradigm, we're going to need a larger decision. We made a big decision, in the 50s and 60s about suburban sprawl. It became the ubiquitous pattern, and it was underwritten at the federal level with highway financing and mortgage insurance and things like that. So we need some clarity on what direction we're going in, and we need a series of levels of legislation to support it.
Well, one variable, and you're leading me into a kind of where some climate change questions, because one variable that plays into this that might help decide it for all of us is climate change. And we're already experiencing the impacts, whether it's flooding, sea level rise, wildfires, extreme heat and storms. And thinking about, we have to be thinking about how to manage these uncertainties and the risk involved. And it's been leading, and this is an area where I've been doing a lot of work, it's leading me to kind of think about the future in more of a Zen sense of impermanence in our planning. When we're having to maybe shift places and core assets because of, and things that have cost a tremendous amount of money because of risks. So how do you imagine climate hazards and risks impacting how we build, where we build, and even the types of transit we use now and into the future?
Well, it's not very complicated. The reality is you can map all those hazards and you can just draw lines. I mean, there ought to be, in terms of future development, there ought to be boundaries. And the boundaries, once again, lead us back towards infill and redevelopment. There are some sites, the redevelopment sites that can be underwater, but there's already people living there and doing things there. That's where we need to invest money in protection. We don't need to keep expanding into wildfire zones. And that's what the exurban sprawl, at least in the West Coast, has led to. Once again, it's farther away, it's more expensive to get there and back, and it also tends to be more vulnerable. So it's a win-win to come back and say, it's time to mature and start re-inhabiting the worst parts of our existing communities instead of going outwards. Now, I'm a big believer in both adaptation and mitigation. We got to reduce our carbon emissions, and I think we can. We just need the political will. It's the same with land use and renewable investments in technology. And by the way, the federal government, if it's going to have a strategy for climate change, it needs to have a strategy for bigger investments in transit. And why not the next generation of transit? I mean, why invest in the old technology when we got this amazing new technology coming that could really give us ubiquitous transit? Transit on every arterial means transit is, typically within a half mile of everybody. And if you build a ribbon of urbanism along that environment, you have places to walk and bike to that are meaningful, that aren't just a parking lot in front of a shopping center. So, you know, there's a win-win here on profound levels. But, you know, if you think we have challenges, and I did work in southern Louisiana after Katrina, we have the capacity to engineer a bunch of solutions, and they can be beautiful and benign. They can be barrier islands and wetlands. They don't have to be riprap everywhere, but we can afford it. You know, Ho Chi Minh City is 40% of it already floods regularly. And they're because they don't have control over their planning, another, almost doubling of that is going to happen with future growth. Why? Because poor people show up and they inhabit areas that are low-lying and cheap, and they create informal settlements. So, you know, there are different kinds of challenges around the planet. There are always solutions.
Thanks. I'm going to shift us. We have another question from the chat that I'm going to turn to that's asking what your thoughts are on land value taxation as a solution to sprawl. How or does this vision change if you apply an anti-racist lens?
Well, I don't know quite how those two fit together, but you know, I did point out one of the exciting discoveries we made was that the tax increment, when you redevelop, is so large that it can actually underwrite affordable housing, transit, parks, public services. I mean, it's kind of a huge opportunity. So that's part of the financing knuckle.
Those were two questions. So just two separate questions. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Sorry.
I was just trying to see how.
Yeah.
I worked. One of the most wonderful things I ever got to do was work with Henry Cisneros on the Hope 6 projects of rebuilding public housing in so many of the worst locations around the United States. And it's an unsung success. It's just a huge win. We put in mixed income housing in every one of those big sites. 1/3 market rate, 1/3 affordable, and 1/3 public. And it's all rental. So every unit had to work for every market segment. And these communities have thrived. They've just, you know, and a lot of people said, well, the market rate units, nobody's going to want to be there. Yeah, it's just all sorts of economic integration. So to me, that's the most important thing we have to start doing is more diversity in income level in every neighborhood. Well, let me come back to the same old sales job I'm doing here, which is by putting housing on those arterials, the El Camino cuts right through the heart of Palo Alto and Menlo Park and some of the wealthiest places on the planet. And all of a sudden they would have affordable housing in their midst. And a lot of people are frightened by that, but I think it's actually healthy, doable, and something we've proven succeeds with the Hope 6 program.
Yeah, that was a note. Thank you. That was a note I made when you were talking about these arterials. You know, you mentioned underutilized land is undervalued. And the question that did come up for me was, you know, this notion of gentrification and driving up land values. But you're saying there's enough there, you know, these gray fields, these 15,000 acres just on El Camino, or Bay Area wide.
Yeah.
So you think there's enough there. Who needs to be in that mix to make sure that value that's created is going to invest in the right types of housing, the right, you know, all the things that you're talking about? Who needs to be part of that solution? How are we going to make this work politically? I mean, you know, this isn't, as you noted, we're not operating in a vacuum here. We live in a highly charged political environment. You know, based on your years of experience, how are we going to make this happen?
Well, you know, this is a perfect opportunity for Trump to say, I told you so, they want to kill the suburbs. But the reality is we're just dealing with real needs in the world today. And there's just a tremendous need for a more affordable form of living, effectively. If we choose not to let the working people's average wage go up, which it needs to. But anyway, that'll get me too far afield to get into that social equity dimension of all this. But I think that there's no reason we can't be very sophisticated with state legislation, regional regulations, and local standards. All three of those things need to nest together to create a coherent environment. But state legislation can very easily say, well, if there's tax increment financing, 1/3 of that has to go to subsidize affordable housing. And if you have an as of right stipulation, let's say your as of right for averages maybe 30 units per acre along these strips. It's not that high to get to these big numbers. You can say, if you have this as of right gift, in return, you have to make sure that there's 30% affordable within. This is all stuff that can very easily be part of legislation. So I think it's completely feasible. The only thing, politically, it can happen if we can finally get out of our stovepipe mentality. We have the environmental groups over here that are all about climate change and saving open space and habitat. That's great. We have social equity people for affordable housing. We have, I think, totally reasonable business people who are concerned about the economy. Each one needs to come together, and we all need to come together and find that there are common solutions that actually enhance everybody's future, that we can make a better physical environment, that we can have more affordable housing, and that jobs grow in regions that aren't suffering from overpriced housing and transportation costs.
Great. I'm going to bring us to something we're all living in, that we're experiencing right now, and that's been a little bit of a touch point in the Bay Area as of late. So COVID has accelerated remote work or teleworking in unanticipated ways. As I'm finding in some research I'm doing in the Bay Area on remote work, it can have very different impacts in even just different parts of the Bay. We mentioned Santa Clara County versus San Francisco. Most people in Santa Clara are driving single occupancy vehicles to and many of the jobs are in the tech sector. Whereas in San Francisco, most people are coming into San Francisco or traveling through San Francisco using public transit. So, I think it's important to approach something like this. I think many people are looking at remote work as a way to address some of our congestion, greenhouse gas reduction goals. How do you see, I guess it leads to a larger question. How do you see where and how we work, along with where and how we live, fitting into the transit-oriented future that you're proposing? And what are the changes that we might see in how we live based on what you're thinking about? I want you to have a crystal ball and help predict our future, if you wouldn't mind, Peter.
Yeah, not a problem. It's a simple solution. The reality is, I think we're going to work three ways. We're going to work from home, we're going to work from neighborhood, and then we're going to work at headquarters. And I think, so those of us lucky enough to work in a kind of digital service world, that's going to be easy and it's going to happen. We're all experiencing the work from home phenomenon now, and it's, can be part of our life, but it can't be everything. It drives, there's a little bit too many distractions at home all the time. And we don't get to interact with other people in truly creative ways. But that neighborhood scale workplace does bring me back to Grand Boulevards. A lot of people say, well, what are you going to put on the ground floor? There isn't that much retail, and you can't fill it all with coffee shops. I actually think, local work areas, shared work areas, like WeWorks, can begin to fill that niche of the place that you can bike to, and you don't have to go all the way into the main office. It's decentralized, but it's not in your attic, as it were. So I see those three things fitting together, once again, reinforcing the idea that we need to infill our way to more mixed use places. And that's just a really healthy component of what the mixed use is going to involve.
It's interesting because some of the data that we're collecting, it's still kind of parsing it out. But if we approach this from a racial equity lens, which I think we need to do in all of our work, you look at who's eligible for remote work and who isn't, and it really breaks down starkly by income and in many cases race. And where you have people making 100,000 or more, you have 76% of the jobs remote work eligible, and if you're making 40,000 or less, 6% of the jobs are remote work eligible. So I think it is one of those things. We have to be mindful of: do we want to live in regions where it's white people are working from home and Black and brown people are out using public transit and driving to their jobs that are not remote work eligible? I think those are and I think if it's a split and we're thinking about community serving, where people can go to a library to do remote work or a community center, then those are the types of policy solutions it seems like we need to explore in this. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
But the real issue that you're raising is the equity issue around affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And I tend to want to talk more about workforce housing, because unless we can find a systemic solution to workforce housing, to lower middle class wages, being able to afford a decent, convenient place to live, we're all in deep, deep trouble. And that's where the biggest economic pain comes from. And I think that until we get a really large scale strategy in place that really delivers enough housing, all the housing will be too expensive and all low income populations will suffer more and more. And so we've got to find a way to be housing positive and at a big scale, and stop trying to parse this into, well, we can satisfy this category this way, and this category this way, and this category this way. We need a systemic solution to the housing crisis, and that has to be wedded to a transportation strategy.
So you brought up the role, this state policy and state action. I guess for folks that are listening who are from advocacy organizations or in the public sector or private sector, this shift on needing state action to help support this affordable housing vision that you've outlined is that's a tactic. That's a tactic, an advocacy tactic. I'm really thinking about how we operationalize this in this political environment we're living in. So you've helped identify kind of the role of the state, the role of regions, the role of localities, and then all the different stakeholders that need to be part of this solution.
I think it's all about coalition building. And too often each group, nonprofit group, advocacy group goes at it from one-dimensionally. You shouldn't be just an affordable housing advocate. You should be an environmental advocate and a transportation advocate and a economic development all at once. And that kind of common ground really needs to be forged. And to a certain degree, that's what Revolution, and there are some organizations that are cross-cutting, that solve many problems simultaneously. And when you solve many problems simultaneously, that's when you can build coalitions that will make a political difference.
And how important is the data behind that, supporting that work? You're doing a lot of data collection. Where do you think, what's the balance of having the data and to help make persuasive arguments? Do you think we have all the data we need?
We have more data than we can consume. I guarantee you that. Yeah. The challenge is extracting intelligence and value out of the data. It's about asking the right questions and creating the right scenarios. Always been a great believer in scenarios. The what if, what if we did this? What if we did that? And a lot of our regional plans over the decades have been showing regions different versions of their future. And then, it becomes crystal clear what the best direction to head in is, and all of a sudden there's a different attitude about the synthesis between land use and transportation and financing and environment. So I think the data, the ability to understand the physical landscape precisely, and the ability to shape scenarios and get outcomes is really, really powerful. I mean, just the fact that we could push a button and identify every parcel, and I can actually tell you what the average parcel size is. I can tell you what the average parcel value, current value is. I mean, all that data is available. How many units of housing are there? How many square feet of commercial is there? Everything is at our fingertips. So we can answer really big visionary questions quite precisely, which is an exciting moment.
Yeah. I'm just going to ask, we have a few more minutes, but I just want to hit on the financing piece of this really quickly. But, you know, you've lifted up the tax increment financing as a concept. What are the other, what are the financial tools that you see that exist? You know, TIF is challenging in California, but in other parts of the country, Buffalo, there's a contingent from Buffalo that are participating in Rail Volution this year that are thinking
through I just looked at their regional plan. Really well done. Beautiful regional plan. You know, I think that all the mechanisms are available. Just bonding against sales tax, which has often been the way of putting transit dollars together. Federal dollars have to play a really big role, and the Fed needs to decide that the future isn't just a few more freeways. So there are many sources that we are going to have to combine to make a difference. And then, you know, unfortunately, we have to think long and hard about the fact that the land use complement to those investments has to be made real. In other words, if you build transit without transit-oriented development, whether it's a ribbon or a dot, you know, whatever form it takes, you're getting less cost effectiveness out of that transit investment. The other thing, of course, is that with transit, you can, I think with these new forms, it really will be faster and cheaper, both to build and to operate. And if that's the case, we can afford a lot more of it. So if you have a bonding capacity that's a 0.5-cent sales tax or something like that, and you can build, you know, 10 miles of light rail, or you can build 100 miles of ART, I call that autonomous rapid transit, you know, all of a sudden the justification for that tax base and that bonding is much more substantial. And it reaches more people. The other reason people tend not to want to vote for transit is they look at the line and they say, well, that's nowhere near me. What the heck? Whereas, you know, with this kind of thing, I think it really could be so ubiquitous as to be everywhere. And so I hope that gets at it. But, you know, I do think it needs to start at the federal level. You know, part of the climate solution has to be investment in transit. And once you invest in transit, you have to follow it with land use policy.
I want to thank you for your leadership and your continued evolution in thinking about how to make our cities and regions equitable, meet all our climate goals, all the goals that we've outlined here. You know, you've heard a lot here today. I hope we can all carry forward with these ideas, continually thinking about TOD as a field of practice that is adaptive and responsive to changing conditions. And I want to thank Rail Volution for inviting me, and thank Peter Calthorpe for his leadership. And make sure you hit up the PK Slam this evening. That should be a lot of fun. And enjoy the rest of your conference.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old daily cities news list, by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.